Qualia Vision is a supplement for optimized eyes. And if you want to go really deep into it, in this video, it's about how and why does it work, what's the story and the concept behind the formulation, how you can increase the bioavailability of Qualia Vision, and why blue light blocking glasses are necessary but not sufficient. I interviewed Greg Kelly. Greg is the lead formulator at Neurohacker Collective, and we go really deep into optimizing your eyes and optimizing with Qualia Vision. Hi, Greg. Welcome back. It's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Max. It's wonderful to reconnect with you. It's been a bit.
I'm really curious to learn more about Qualia Vision. How did you come up with the idea of creating a supplement for the eyes? Like, what was the idea, the story behind it?
So this probably started 2.5 years ago originally, and in part it was so if you think of the brain, they usually would divide different skills we do into buckets, so cognitive domains. So those are your memory, your attention, your social cognition, executive function, language, and the sixth bucket is visual spatial. So when we created our nootropic, so Qualia Mind especially, we really dialed in on things to do with attention and memory and executive function. As you know from when you visited Neurohacker after the energy shot came out, that one put in some things for social cognition as well. But I always felt like we were weak in the visual social or visual spatial. Not like there wasn't anything in there, but it wasn't optimized for that. So that was part of it. And then the other part is just over time, I've had more and more people that I'm friends with tell me that their eyes are getting hammered from being on screens all the time and like having symptoms, right? Watery eyes, dry eyes, burning eyes. And so, I would say somewhere about 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago, I started really pushing Neurohacker to we should do a blue light protection screen time vision product that also has that cognitive angle for the visual system. Mm-hmm. So really that's where it originated. And then with, how the world's trended with, education and work Zoom meetings and all, kinds of I do a weekly trivia on Zoom. I think we've done it for the last 70 weeks, every Tuesday or Wednesday night. So just more and more of our leisure and social things are also on screens. Yeah. And so that was the trajectory, right? Feeling, be good to have something that builds out this capacity in the brain. Mm-hmm. And our eyes really need extra support from screen time stress right now.
I think I'm on one of your email lists where you always invite me when there are new products coming out. And I think you always invite a couple of people or even hundreds of people to be in a beta program, like a study. And these people try out the product before you kind of finalize the formulation and bring the product to the market. So I'd be interested, what were the results of your study that you did, and what happened to the people and what did you see?
So what we always do before launching any new product would be to do some kind of a real world, we would think of it as a pilot survey, right? It's not double blind controlled, but we're sending products out and typically assessing something. So in this case, we used a questionnaire that measured about a dozen symptoms related to eye strain. So those are things like, my eyes feel strained, my eyes feel dry, my shoulders and neck feel stiff, so those types of things. So what we did is we sent out an invitation like you would have got, had literally about 700 people respond to it and fill out an initial survey where they estimated how many hours a day they were on different screens and filled out this survey as a baseline to get kind of an eye strain score. And basically we then invited about 50 of those people, 48 exactly, to participate, all of whom had high amounts of screen time and what I would think of as pretty above average screen time stress symptoms. So we wrote this up on our blog, but they would have had an average score of about 26, which is pretty high. And so then what we did is we sent one group instructions to take one capsule 5 days on, 2 days off, and another 24 people instructions to basically to take twice as much, so that we had an A/B test because we wanted to see if there was a dose response, basically. Did doubling the doses of these things, we don't ever expect that to double the response, but was it significantly better? And then we gave them enough to do for 4 weeks, because we felt like that's for a lot of these eye things, especially with digital eye screens, something like lutein, very well known for vision. A lot of those studies start at 3 months and will go for 6 months or a year. So we felt like, a month was a good test. That would be basically someone buying a bottle, and I would, for it to be a viable product, I would expect a significant relief of their symptoms. So, that's kind of the lay of the land for how we went about it. And what we saw is, like both groups together, so whether they took one or two, the average reduction in the score was about 76%. So huge drop. And it happened pretty quickly.
So like 76%, and the score means basically a summary of the different symptoms they were scoring.
So each symptom we had people rate from like not experiencing it at all to slightly, moderately, severely, very severely, and then we assigned a point. So I believe the point scoring was 0 to 4.
Yeah. What were the most common symptoms people had?
So the most common things, at least in terms of the most people having them, almost everyone had eye strain in this. But again, we selected people that were on screens a lot. Almost everyone had shoulder and neck stiffness. When you got into things that were more like blurry vision, then it was more like 2/3 of people would have had that experience. So it varied for each individual one of these about a dozen symptoms, from about half the people to almost 100%. And so what we did is we summed the scores for each symptom, and that gave us an average starting point of around 26, 27. And the final score was about 8.
Wow.
So that's when we say like reduced by 76%, that's basically what we're saying, that essentially people that were rating these individual symptoms as, often severe or very severe, by the end we're saying like not experiencing it or slight.
That sounds huge. So let's get into the formulation and the concept behind Qualia Vision. Maybe you can go into like the 2 or 3 most important ingredients, if they're like more important or less important ones, and maybe also a bit into the studies, because I saw you were using ingredients that are really have been proven in studies to be beneficial for the eyes. Maybe you could like pinpoint some of the highlights of your formulation.
Sure. So we'll start with Lutamax 2020. So what Lutamax 2020 is basically a branded, clinically studied form of lutein, zeaxanthin, and then a rarer type of zeaxanthin called mesozeaxanthin. It's basically the isomer of that. But like chemistry aside, those 3, they're carotenoids. So they're in the same general family as beta carotene. Those 3 carotenoids actually can get into the eye. So like the brain has the blood-brain barrier, the eye has the blood-retinal barrier. So unless something can cross that, it can't get into the eye. And so one of the entertaining things is that, beta carotenes, eat your carrots. Beta carotene's often thought of for eyes, but can't get into the eyes. And actually really isn't able to get into the brain in any significant way because of its chemistry. Where these are called macular carotenoids because they can get in and they accumulate in the macula area of the retina. And the way I would explain it, so if you think like the earliest like evolutionary thing that led to an eye, it was essentially something that would capture light and then was shaded by carotenoids, right? So like a photoreceptor and a pigment combination. So that what they would call an eye spot, I mean, it still exists in some, like bacteria, algae, some really, small organisms, but our eyes still use that combo. And what the carotenoid pigments do is act a bit like shade. So it lets them essentially filter some of the light, which is really important for high energy light, like blue light, and give a sense of direction to where the light's coming from, where a photoreceptor on its own couldn't do that, right? So these macular pigments, we evolved, or our eyes evolved, to use these things like lutein, zeaxanthin for really critical roles, especially when it comes to sensing subtle differences in light. So, like as an example, when I generally talk to people about vision, the one thing that they think of is eyesight, basically 20/20 vision, right? Which the truth is there's relatively limited things in the real world where we have to see 20/20, right? So like if you were in a classroom staring at a blackboard or trying to make out something on a presentation, reading letters, 20/20 would matter. But imagine you're a gardener and you have, green snap peas in your garden and you have to make out those on a green leafy background. That's not 20/20 vision, that's contrast sensitivity. And
Maybe
so
you can explain what do you mean by 20/20 vision?
Oh, so 20/20 vision basically means you can see something clearly at 20 feet. It would be how in the US measurement. And it's a standard letter size. So it would be the kind of test, at least in the US, that we would do to pass our driver's license test, right? Which when you're driving would be useful if you have to read a speed limit sign, as an example. But for most of the other things like that you need your vision to do while driving, so peripheral vision and being able to make out, like changes in movement and speed, visual acuity is not as important. These other visual jobs are way more important. So, like in a simple sense, what these macular pigments do is they help us do some of these other jobs really well, and they have a little bit of a role in visual acuity. But they're not going to take someone that wears, say, corrective lenses, contacts, or glasses and make them see 20/20. That's their job is very different. And so one of the things, so lutein's been studied, same with zeaxanthin, extensively for especially vision-related things with aging to keep the macula healthy. And over the last, I would say, 5 years, there's been a big emphasis on lutein for cognition, which makes sense. So, and the story there is just like lutein, it can cross the blood-retinal barrier and get into the eyes. It can cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. So of all the carotenoid compounds, lutein is the one that's highest concentration in the brain, especially in areas that would do visual processing. So, and then the reason we chose Lutamax 20/20. So in a lot of studies that have been done on lutein or zeaxanthin, it's basically been unhealthy older eyes, and they've given these. And Lutamax 20/20 I thought was really cool because they've taken a different approach. So their classic study, they refer to it as the BLUE study, BLUE. And I loved it because it was on young, healthy eyes, basically like, people 24 years old or so. They gave it for 3 or 6 months. All of these people had at least 4 hours of screen time. That was part of the criteria to get into the study. And then they measured not only things to do with relief of digital eye strain, but they measured sleep quality, they measured stress response. Another study independent of this, they measured BDNF, which is like a neuroplasticity compound. And they did a 3-month and a 6-month check-in and basically rocked, right? They did great in relieving some of these symptoms of digital eye strain, sleep quality improved, stress went down. And so when Neurohacker, one of our, I would say, guiding principles is we're about, high performers performing even higher. So I'm much more attracted to things that were done in young, healthy people and improved their performance than, some like a dysfunctional area and made a difference there. So that was the tipping point for Lutamax 20/20. These pigments are just functionally, our eyes cannot perform lots of visual jobs if we don't have enough. They're not impossible to get in the diet, but very few people would consume enough foods high in macular pigments to kind of keep the tanks full. And then we loved Lutamax 20/20 because it really was studied in the exact areas that we wanted to make a difference in.
Maybe you can go into talking about the whole formulation, like how did you come up with that and why did you combine all these ingredients that are in there?
Sure. So so this is, I'm going to simplify this into a story, but vision, like we have color vision, right? So we can see, basically we have 3 color channels of input. Some people that are red-green colorblind, they're missing one of those channels, right? So they see fewer distinctions of colors. And there's a very, very tiny subset of women that have a fourth channel that have kind of super color vision. And color vision, again, is a very important part of how our eyes work, especially for jobs we do in the daytime. And what I mentioned, like pigments in the proto-eyes as playing an important role, different color pigments essentially absorb or protect from different shades of light or different frequencies or wavelengths of light. And this is basically a truism. On the visible spectrum, so the colors of the rainbow we can see, things that have shorter wavelengths, so that vibrate faster, that's the blue-purple end of the spectrum, have more energy. Things that vibrate slower and have longer wavelengths, so that's the red end, moving into infrared, those things have less energy. And each time a photon of light energy is absorbed by a photoreceptor, it creates oxidative stress because there's a price to pay for capturing energy, basically. And so our eyes evolved to handle that, but more of a variety of colored pigments, especially in the carotenoid and anthocyan family, give more antioxidant protection and give more range of filtering activity. So astaxanthin would specialize in slightly different wavelengths than lutein. So lutein's more yellow in color. Astaxanthin's, it's what gives flamingos or salmon that, orangey red color. So these different pigments all do slightly different light filtering, plus antioxidants. So one of the things we wanted to do was put in a range of colors. So we have, carotenoids from saffron, which saffron has a unique carotenoid called crocin. We have astaxanthin, we have the lutein and zeaxanthin. We've got goji fruit, which is a Chinese superfruit that's used in Chinese or traditional Chinese medicine as their key vision ingredient. And that's thought to be the best food source of zeaxanthin, so another one of these carotenoids. And then, we put in bilberry extract, which is like essentially the European cousin to the American blueberry. It grows in bogs and wild places throughout, especially elevation and cooler places in Northern Europe. And that is, that really dark blue purple. And what makes bilberry somewhat distinct from blueberries is blueberries have almost a translucent flesh. So they're, blue-purple on the outside, but the inside really isn't. Mm-hmm. Where bilberries are like a red-blue even on the inside, which the thing that gives that color is the anthocyanins, so the polyphenols. And so that those do a different job. They're more involved in filtering for UV radiation and for regenerating night vision type of processes as a pigment. So what we wanted to do was craft something that had a range of colors, because these different colors, when selected well, all have slightly different roles. And then we put in, so we're like, again, this is a more philosophy, but Neurohacker, we love things from Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine that have stood the test of time in some area. So in Ayurveda, there's a concept called rasayanas, which essentially would translate like rejuvenators. And there's very few things that are in that family. One of them is this fruit called amla. And amla specifically is the rasayana for what we would now translate almost as the visual system. It was what was thought to, improve eyesight and like the ability to perceive the world visually. And so there's not a ton of research yet. There's some preclinical, so mice, so we can understand some of the things it does, but we included that because one, different color, and two, the traditional use really made sense with what we were trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. So, and of those, the bilberry is by far the most studied for the visual system. Mm-hmm. We used, so bilberry, since it's very difficult to cultivate, so blueberries you can cultivate easily, bilberry is hard to cultivate. So most of it is picked wild. And I've been in the supplement world since the late 90s, and even back then there was a lot that it's called adulterated. Basically, faked. And the reason is because there's always more of a demand for the bilberries than what can be grown, in the wild. And so we use one called Murdo Select, but that's been studied since the 70s. It's from an Italian company, Indina, and it's been used in over 60 studies, mostly human, a vast majority, related to vision, the brain, or a healthy heart. Basically, those have been their three big emphases. So one of the things we believe is that for things like that, it's really important to use the studied product.
Yeah.
And so with that, lots of cool studies on bilberry. But one of the things that, again, I like to look for when I'm reviewing the research is studies that have combined a few things together. And bilberry at the dose we ended up using has been used in a few studies combined with things like the macular carotenoids. And so that combination, they just do very different things. So the story I told our marketing person is, like, I see a lot of vision products that are very, I would say, designed for the back of the eye, so for the macular. And for our vision to work, the front of the eye, the cornea, the lens, the muscles that move the eye, those also need support. And so when I was thinking of Qualia Vision, it's like, okay, we want to essentially support both. We don't want to just go overboard on the back of the eye and have a macular formula. We want something that really is going to help the front of the eye and the back of the eye. And with digital eye strain, like with all the blue light we're getting from computers, what happens is a lot of what we're experiencing as, like issues, so dry eyes, watery eyes, that sense that our eyes are like red or irritated, that's really almost oxidative stress on the front of our eyes. And the other thing that happens when we're, like you and I, looking at this, the number of times we blink a minute goes way down. So in an average conversation, if you were at a cafe having a cup of like bulletproof coffee with a friend, you'd probably be blinking about 20 times a minute. But when you're looking at a screen, that would on average slow down to about 7 and sometimes as low as 3 or 4. And blinking is what keeps our eye surface healthy and comfortable. And so something like bilberry, one of the things that it has been studied for is it does a better job at keeping the front of the eye comfortable, even if we're stressing it with screen time. So that it plays a very different role than the macular pigments, while they all have antioxidant protection and do things for the back of the eye. Lutein's much more a back of the eye, where bilberry has much more front of the eye.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. So you really have a rainbow of ingredients that are also effective on all parts of the eye, and they have either been like studied especially for eyes or just been used for thousands of years when you mentioned like TCM or Ayurveda. So
Goji, which is the one from TCM, has been studied in both preclinical. So by preclinical, I mean in vitro or animal studies, but also in human studies. Amla is the one that's only so far been preclinical. And so we like that. That was much more, again, a front of the eye thing based on the animal studies have generally been related to the lens of the eye, which is, towards the front. And then one of the things, again, that I guess I'm critical when I look at different formulas. And so do you know what amino acid is the most concentrated in the eye of all amino acids?
No.
So it's taurine, which, a very well-known nootropic. Some people use it also, usually in energy drinks in the US quite frequently. But taurine is concentrated in all parts of the eye. And so we felt it was essential to have taurine in part because especially people that are on a more vegan, vegetarian end of the diet continuum get very low amounts of taurine in their diet. So they would have to make, whatever they need in their body. And so taurine in a much higher dose than we used, because we're really just trying to make sure that the diet piece of taurine is fulfilled. But taurine, going back 20 years or so has been studied for people with digital eye strain. So one of the, like my screening criteria was looking for things that had been studied in humans to relieve some of the symptoms of digital eye strain.
Gotcha. So I have to ask, my channel is on biohacking, on holistic health, and probably, a lot of biohackers are already using these kind of funny looking yellow glasses, especially in the evening, to protect their eyes from the screens, the blue light emitted from the screens. Can we just use the blue light blocking glasses instead of vision, or should we use it together? What's your opinion on that?
We were talking before we started recording. I've got my blue blockers like an arm reach away, and you'll hear this phrasing sometimes on biohacker podcasts of necessary but not sufficient. But what that basically means is there's some things that on their own that are useful, but wouldn't do everything that you need them to do. And so for me, I put blue blockers in that category. So if like we talked about Lutamax 2020 and lutein. So what blue blockers are going to do is they'll filter some of the light out before it gets to the front of your eye. But these macular pigments have lots of jobs beyond just being blue light filters. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, and so this has to do with how the eyes work. So a big part, like if you look at studies on the stress the eyes go on or go through because of screens, what you see is when someone's on a computer, after about 2 hours, the vast majority of people start to experience a big uptick in their eye strain symptoms. But if you're looking at a smartphone, it's about an hour. If you're watching a streaming video on your iPad or tablet, the same, like within an hour. And part of that has to do, it's called near work. But basically, we're holding these things closer than a computer screen would be. So our eyes have to essentially rotate slightly in so that our focal point can converge. So that's called convergence. And then to make it so that light hits the right part of the retina, the muscles around our lens have to work. And that's called accommodation. And so a lot of the symptoms that we're experiencing when we're on a screen aren't because of the blue light. They're because we're literally just hammering these muscles for hours on end. So blue blockers won't do anything for that, right? Their job is completely different. So for things like supporting those muscles, that's something astaxanthin, bilberry are able to support. For the ocular surface, that front of the eye, blue blockers are useful to a degree because they're going to cut down some of the blue light, maybe reduce some of then the oxidative stress. And it's, so again, necessary but not sufficient. They're not going to do things that will make us blink any more rapidly or have better quality tears to spread over our eye surface when we blink. But antioxidants and polyphenols will do those things. So I guess the key message is if you're wearing blue blockers, awesome. I wear them. A lot of the Neurohacker team wears them. And just think of it as it's one piece of a puzzle, but it's not anywhere close to the whole puzzle.
The suggested serving size is just one capsule, right? You mentioned also in the beta-prochlorobrine, you tested 1 and 2 as a dosage, but one capsule is enough, right, to take it?
Yeah, so what we saw is there was about a 72% change in the symptom score in the people that were taking the one capsule, and about a 79% in the people that were taking 2. So 2 worked better, it just didn't work ridiculously better.
Yep.
And
there's
so,
like a diminishing return when you take more than 1.
Yeah. What I would suggest for people, if you're experiencing a lot of current stress on your eyes, then maybe do the first month or first couple of weeks with 2, see how you're doing, and then 1 might be sufficient after that. But for most people, it didn't seem that it was worth taking double the dose to get, I'm a big believer in the 80-20 rule. Like this was definitely an 80-20
Makes sense,
type of situation.
You guys have a lot of awesome products. I think I have some of them behind me here. And two I'm taking right now regularly is Qualia Mind and Qualia Life. How would you combine Vision with these other Qualia products? And is there a specific time of the day? Like, does it make more sense to take it in the evening, Vision, or what are your suggestions on that?
During the survey, like the pilot survey we did when we sent it out to the 48 people, we recommended everyone take it in the morning. And the reason we did is, one, it's just an easier habit for most people to get into, doing something, at the start of their day. Two, one of the things we discovered when formulating night, and because we did a series of recipes before we landed on that, is that things that we had people do at dinner were much more likely to be disruptive of sleep than we would have expected. So in general, I just think it's a better idea to take new things early in the day if we don't know. But I have no reason to think this wouldn't be, fine to take in the evening. In a lot of the studies on the individual ingredients, they've, done them in divided doses, like take one capsule in the morning, one in the evening kind of thing. But the key thing, and I think this is much more important than when you take it, is taking it with something that has fat. Mm-hmm. So the macular carotenoids, the astaxanthin are fat soluble. And the general rule of thumb is fat soluble ingredients are much more bioavailable, taken not only with fat, but typically at the tail end of a meal with fat. So it would be better to take the Qualia Vision after something, like at the end of a meal with fat, rather than right before it even. In terms of playing well with our other products, we're very comfortable that this is, like I think of this as the perfect complement to something like, Qualia Mind as an example, because it's just taking an area of cognition, that visual spatial, and rounding that out in a way that Mind wasn't optimized for. So like as an example, you're someone that does esports or really into video gaming, Mind's going to get you a lot, like in my experience, a lot of performance enhancements. And over time, augmenting the visual end of things also makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. If we were to say, okay, well, what about Qualia Night? So that's, our evening relaxation, sleep quality. So I mentioned the Blue study done on Lutamax 2020, where over like 3 and 6 months, giving Lutamax 2020 enhanced sleep quality in those, again, they were, early 20-year-old. So the thing with some of these, again, fat soluble things, they don't work, quickly, right? It takes a while for these to, build up. Astaxanthin, lutein are things that are very important for membrane health, and that's just a slower game to rebuild the membranes to make them more healthy and resilient.
I've tested Qualia Vision for over a week, and I must say I really enjoyed the product. If you want to get your hands on a bottle of this, be sure to get your 15% discount at neurohacker.com by using my coupon code MAXHACK. And if you live in Europe, you can order from a European shop. I linked that down below in the description. And if you want to see more reviews on biohacking products and my biohacking experiments, be sure to check out my YouTube channel. Sending you much love from Switzerland.